Uh, Good evening, everybody. Am I audible? Can you hear me? Okay. So it's a privilege and an honor to do this session with Richard Blurton, who is one of the most experienced and one of the most respected names in the broad field of South Asian art history and museums. Richard, as you know already, he had been associated for a very long time with the British Museum, one of the world's greatest museums, and with one of the most iconic collections of South and Southeast Asian art. And Richard had been a curator of South and Southeast Asian art at that museum for many, many years. And the occasion of this conversation, the focus of the conversation is this book, which Richard has written. It has come out just a few months ago. India, A History in Objects, which is 320 pages and absolutely sumptuously illustrated. And so without further ado, we will go into the conversation straight away. Now, India, A History in Objects, as you can well imagine, it's a history of not India as such, but the South Asian subcontinent. It also includes artworks from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. So it's a book on South Asian history attempted through an examination of its art objects that are part of the iconic British Museum collection. Now, in 2011, the former director of British Museum, Neil MacGregor, wrote this book, which was originally a radio show, but later came out as a book titled A History of the World in 100 Objects. And that went on to become one of the most well-received and most, a landmark publication in the history of looking at history of civilizations, cultures, and the world itself through a study of its objects, right? And that book has gone on to inspire many other similar publications. The list is long. I can immediately remember the Smithsonian Institution's publication called The History of the United States in 101 Objects, which is directly modeled on Neil MacGregor's book. And so Richard's book, I think, is, partially influenced by Neil MacGregor's book, but it is different in its approach. Obviously, it is also a look at South Asian history through art objects, but I think there is a major difference, and I'm going to ask Richard about this slightly later. But Neil MacGregor's book, The History of the World in 100 Objects, was a study of the objects themselves. Although the objects were used to write an interconnected history of the world, so the objects were not discrete objects as such. They were not isolated objects, but they all resonated of a connected history of the world. Compared to that, I felt that Richard's book here is structurally more similar to conventional histories of the South Asian subcontinent. It has a chronological framework, and it looks at objects as sort of catalysts of historical change. But I'm going to ask Richard later about this. The first question that I wanted to ask Richard is that, as I said, he is one of the most experienced curators, art historians on South Asia, and you have been visiting India for more than 50 years now. From 1970, early 1970s? 1970 itself. And that was a different kind of time, So that was a time when I guess, even in the Indian art scenario, there were very few art galleries. Private collections of art had not been properly excavated. So the world of Indian art was comparatively less exposed to the outside world at that time. India did not have an Antiquities Act back then. And also, I think this is also, we need to take note of this, that this was before what we call the post-colonial turn in history, and it was before the publication of, the iconic text, Edward Said's Orientalism. So the study of the cultural politics of representation of particular cultures through its material culture, objects, paintings, and so on, that had not also begun at that point of time. So I would like to ask Richard about telling us a little bit about your evolving relationship with India and the art world of India. Had you already started working in the British Museum back then?
Oh, no. No, certainly not. In 1970, I mean, I'm very old, but in 1970 I wasn't yet 20, so I certainly wasn't at the British Museum. I joined the museum in 1986 after quite a peripatetic but useful period in my life when I worked as a field archaeologist, not only in the Mediterranean but also in South Afghanistan, almost unimaginable today, and then also in southern India. So I had an interest in the materiality of things from an early period, because my training was in archaeology. It wasn't in language or in texts. It was in objects. It was, picking something up like this and looking at the front and the back and describing it and thinking how it was made and how it was used and how it deteriorated over time. All of these things are categories of thinking that you develop as an archaeologist. To be a textual historian, someone looking at manuscripts in different scripts and different languages, those are very different skills, and they were not ones that I pursued. But that long period of working in the field unquestionably prepared me for working in a museum which has a large collection of objects which can tell stories. And my book it's like a sort of brain dump after 32 years of working both in the public galleries and in the reserve collections at the British Museum. It's a sort of brain dump as I retired to put on record some of my enthusiasms and interests. And if you look in my book, it's highly partial. There are certain topics that probably are not as well covered as should be. Then there are others, such as textiles or the artistic traditions of itinerant people or of remote people or of tribal groups. All of these get just as much coverage as do the great achievements of temple architecture or of the Mughals. So it's very much my view, after 50 years of coming to this wonderful country, and after 32 years of working with this remarkable collection in London. And one final thing I should just mention is that although the narrative that I present and the images that I use to illustrate it, by the way, there are over 500 images in the book, so it's densely illustrated. Although I start 1.5 million years ago with a hand axe from near Chennai, from Atirampakam, I finish in 2018. So this is an immense stretch of chronological time, an immense stretch of artistic and cultural development and change. And in fact, the last chapter is entirely concerned with the 19th and mostly 20th centuries here in India.
Thank you, Richard. Now, I was also wondering what sort of led you to choose this particular format of writing this book, which is different from MacGregor's book or the other books almost modeled on that publication. You have given us a book which, in my view, and I have sort of transitioned from the academic practice of history to the museum profession. So I have seen books like yours, and I am also familiar with survey texts of South Asian history as such. And unlike MacGregor's book, for instance, I think, this is my personal feeling, that your book might have been offered as a survey text for history classrooms as well, because it sort of grapples with most of the important historical transitions, most of the important social and historical processes, and so on. So my personal interest is in knowing what led you to write a book focusing on objects. Of course, it's a history of material culture, but what led you to place your objects in the big picture of a broadly chronologically arranged historical narrative?
The answer,
and there is a related question: is that what would be, in your view, for instance, the difference or similarities between such a book written by a professional historian and by a museum professional like you?
Right. The answer to your first question is that I was commissioned to write it.
Of course.
And this commissioning took place while I was still a staff member at the British Museum, so it was part of my day job, if you like. Then I retired, and then came COVID. So its birth was highly disjointed, but it's part of a series. And there are two previous books. One concerns China, one concerns the Islamic world. Then comes my book on South Asia, and then next year there'll be a book on Southeast Asia. And so the format was more or less fixed by the two previous volumes. I actually did ask if I could change the format, because I mean, Neil was wonderful in ever so many ways, but he could also occasionally be annoying.
So what
I wanted to, at one point I did want to change it, yes, but the publishers said, no, you can't. You either write it in this format or you don't do it. So I was, you could say it was a constraint, but actually it's a very, I now realize it's a very constructive constraint. And, you know, to be forced to think only in terms of objects and only the objects in the British Museum.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, if this was a choice forced on you, it doesn't certainly show in the book.
Good.
I mean, it just flows. Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, one thing that I found very interesting about the book is it is not only about objects, but you also write about, I mean, not only about objects which are specific to a particular time and place, but you are also writing about processes that sort of cut across time and space. And they are very interesting examples, like the game of dice or chess. And you pick that up. There is the use of ivory. That's another process that you choose. The art of storytelling, which is so, which is so distinctive about the South Asian narrative, yeah, and the epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata. And I was curious about knowing what led you to choose these processes and place them among your objects, and what sort of influenced the selection of those particular processes?
Those subjects reflect in large measure my own interests and my own feelings that they're really important in the whole story. You mentioned narrative and the presentation of narrative. For many, many years, this has been a great interest of mine. It started soon after I joined the museum, when I found at the back of a cupboard a properly listed and numbered, but unregarded I found a scroll from this part of the world, a painted scroll that had been collected by J.C. French, who was an ICS officer in the 1920s. Right. And it's over 9 meters long, and the painted registers, there are 53 of them. So this I found very intriguing. It had never been published, and so I spent several years working on that. And that got me hooked on it made me realize that so much Indian art can be explained in the process of narrative, in presenting narrative. If you look at sculpture from Amravati, for instance, you're dealing with the life of the Buddha, the Jatakas, the previous life stories of the Buddha, and so on. And this is all about narrative, and it's the presentation of narrative to a largely illiterate or non-literate clientele. These are people who need the narratives to be presented orally, and that is helped hugely by either painted representations or by sculpted representations. So I felt that I couldn't write this book without mentioning that and giving it some prominence. And similarly with gaming and the use of dice and so on, we have these remarkable examples from Mohenjo-Daro of ivory dice. There are ever so many references, of course, very important references in the great epics to the importance of gaming and the obsession with it. And then, of course, there's the story of Shiva and Parvati, and there are ever so many references. And so I felt that I could use these topics to present very important elements in Indian cultural history.
Thank you, thank you. On that note, you talk about processes like the storytelling tradition and its distinctive place in South Asian culture. And of course, you deal with Ramayana and Mahabharata. And those are two wonderful examples because it is because of the vibrancy of the storytelling tradition that you have translations and transcreations of great stories across cultures. And you yourself mentioned this, you show this, how the Ramayana and the Mahabharata had been translated into Persian by all sorts of Muslim rulers, especially the Mughals, just like the Arabian Nights and other great Central Asian tales had been translated into Indian languages. So you are choosing your examples and also writing your history in order to focus on the connectedness of histories of South Asia. This is something different because there was a time, and I guess when I saw for the first time on television Sir Kenneth Clarke's famous series on civilization, and then later read the book. When I saw it, I didn't know the meaning of Eurocentrism, but when I later read about this, then it certainly appeared Eurocentric, and I remember the one of the first very sweeping, very grandiose statement which Sir Kenneth utters, like, what's a civilization? I don't know, I can't say, but when I see it, I recognize it. That's so. And this was also the time, and I know it as a student of history, and this is around the time from when you have been visiting India, when history courses in the Euro-American Western world, there was a typical history course would be, the European Enlightenment or the history of the Western civilization, from the Reformation to the Industrial Revolution or the First World War or Second World War, whatever. Now, during recent years, they have all changed with the sort of fall of Eurocentrism from grace. They have all changed to histories of the world, connected history of the world. And that is the, sorry.
Yes. Well, I would just say that
yes.
I applaud that move, it seems so obvious to me that knowledge of the Reformation to someone studying history in Calcutta, except for a very small number of people, is not going to be much use, and much better to learn about topics concerned with history here in Bengal. That now seems self-evident to us, though of course it didn't to our predecessors.
Yes. But
in terms of interconnectedness, this is another topic that greatly interests me and is very evident in the material record from India, and which I've written about in the book. We know, for instance, that Indian cotton was being exported to the Red Sea in the early Roman period. We have actual examples surviving. We have examples of Indian cotton dharis in Central Asia at about
in
a
Egypt,
similar
as
time.
you show, yes.
Again, showed in the book.
Yes.
And then, of course, we also have magnificent Indian textiles turning up in different islands of Indonesia. And the example that I show in the book, it's one of a small group, all of which show female figures standing and playing the veena. And all examples that survive have come from one small area, not in one of the main Indonesian islands, but in Sulawesi.
Right.
And so one has to think of orders going out from northern Sulawesi to Gujarat, where these textiles were made, saying, look, send more of those dyed and block printed textiles of ladies playing the veena because they're wildly popular here this season. Because they all come from that small zone in Sulawesi. And this is long before European contact. So it's, we have to remember that India has been a culture that is not only great within its own boundaries, if you like, but also externally. And it's a very dramatic and remarkable story, I think.
Yes, thank you for that, because it sort of, deviates so critically from earlier traditional ideas of civilizations as self-made, insular, broadly unconnected, to the new perception now growing important, more and more important, that civilizations are broadly, porous and permeable, and they are connected. Neil MacGregor's book also, had that idea. But you have done this, such a great exposition of histories, of cultures and civilizations as connected and porous and permeable. Thank you for that. Now again, to go back to Neil MacGregor's book, now we are in 2023, and one question sort of intrigues me as a student of history, is that the history of the world in 100 objects was a great exercise in connected histories and in showing that cultures beyond the pale of the Euro-American West were not somewhere back or beyond, but they were connected in common shared currents of global history. But also it was a history of the world written in 2011, which is something that would be fairly appropriate to do in the case of a universal museum like the British Museum. You have not, you have focused on a South Asian art history, South Asian history through art objects. Of course, that is your area of expertise. But I was just, this is just a curiosity that comes to me, is that would you say that this is still an age for writing those kinds of universalist histories, because the sort of, the self-legitimation of universal museums, or like encyclopedic museums, have come under increasing criticism in recent times, especially in the past 5-6 years. So do you think we can now what would be your opinion about these sorts of texts like universalist histories written through the prism of big, quite representative but incomplete collections?
I think that writing history is never a complete subject.
Absolutely.
So, there will always be people coming along later who will have different views and want to illustrate their texts quite differently. And new theories will come up and old theories will be pulled down. So I think one has to make an effort.
Of course.
Concerning the role of museums with large international collections, of which I think, amongst which we must include one wonderful example here just over the road.
Yes.
The Indian Museum.
Yes. Yes.
But certainly my old institution and many others. I think their great future lies in making their holdings as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, both virtually, well, especially virtually, but also actually, and using their collections. And here, it slightly sticks in the craw, but I'm going to quote Neil MacGregor, who described the British Museum collections as a vast lending library, as if it was a library of books. And I think that is where the future of many such great institutions lies, in enabling their holdings to be seen internationally, securely, of course, and well looked after. But lending is going to be a major element. I mean, it is major already, but I think it's going to increase. And the digital representation of our collections, the British Museum already has 3.5 million individual database records for its collection. So, and it increases every Tuesday. They upload new data every Tuesday. So the ability to, as I have, to be in a remote part of Assam and call up on my computer our database and get local people to help me understand and then present online the elements of the collection. This is a huge, huge benefit. And we're only just at the beginning of understanding how this digital representation of museum collections is concerned. But I have no doubt it's going to be more and more important.
Wow, that's great to know. So are you saying that the British Museum is going to be more open to lending objects and to digital collaborations at least?
All of those things have, I mean, we lend thousands of objects every year already.
Right.
Some of it's national, of course, because we are a national museum, but internationally as well. So now, whether that means we will lend to your institution, I hope we will. I mean, I know the V&A.
We will. That's great. We will hold you to that. Just like Gandhi held Queen Victoria responsible for the Queen's Proclamation of 1858.
Yeah.
So you have all heard it, and that gives me some real ideas. Now I think time is short. We have to have some time for questions. So I will just say this: that you have been familiar with the Indian, South Asian art world for more than 50 years. South Asian art, as we know, is scattered all across the world, and there are so many critically important repositories of South Asian art outside South. Of course, the British Museum, which is one of the most iconic collections, but there are so many other museums of the world where this art is housed. And as you said, your book, notwithstanding how lavishly illustrated and how representative it is necessarily incomplete. So I was curious to know that if you had access to the art collection of South Asia across the whole world, what would have been on your wish list to include in this book, which is not here in the book, and how would that possibly have changed the organization of your book? are there certain
That's a very difficult question to answer. But if I had completely free reign, I suppose one would have to include something from Barhut.
Barhut, yes.
Here in the museum.
I'm just sorry to interrupt, because I have been for a few years the director in charge of the Indian Museum, and then I commissioned a book on the history of the Indian Museum. And in the course of that research, we came to know that the sections of the Bharut Stupa, which is now an iconic section in the Indian Museum, were supposed to go to the British Museum. And you would almost expect that to be a natural process, but the British curators in Indian Museum actually resisted that idea, and they insisted that they must stay in the Indian Museum, which is why you don't have it, we have it.
And actually, although of course the British Museum today has a terrible reputation for securing vast quantities of loot,
Yes.
Mostly India was terribly uninteresting for curators and the public in 19th century Britain.
Yes.
If we'd been as acquisitive in the South Asian area as we were in the Greek and Roman, then there would be some justification for assuming that a great deal had gone to London. Of course, the great collection of Indian sculpture that is in London at the British Museum is sculpture from Amravati.
Yes.
And I had the great fortune to often interact with that. But having said that, there's a much greater collection in Chennai.
Yes.
The recent redisplay of which
Chennai Government Museum, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We've recently seen that. And then, I'm ashamed to say, only for the first time, I went to Vijayawada a couple of months ago and went out to the actual site of Amaravati, and the museum there is a revelation, and I urge anyone who has the opportunity to go there to see that collection. It is really remarkable. So, this made me feel a little less guilty is the wrong word, a little less defensive of our holding of Amravati in London. And I should also say that having that collection there enables us to say something to our very large international audience. We have something like 6 million visitors every year, most of whom would never be able to come to India to see Indian artifacts and the achievements of Indian culture. And we can use our collections, if you like, as a sort of advertisement for India, not only to this huge body of international visitors, but also, of course, we have a large Indian community in the UK today, and this is also their heritage. So we can use it in this large number of ways to promote an understanding and an appreciation of Indian culture. And I think this is another area where in the future we're going to be doing more and more.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing with us your experience, your insights, also your promises, to which we will hold you. But I think there we have a little time left for questions, and I'm sure you have several questions. So I would request you to keep your questions brief and pointed. And so please, mics could be handed over, please. There's a hand raised there in the second row.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful discussion and conversation. It was remarkable. At the start of the conversation, you talked about your training as an archaeologist and this sort of engagement with these objects to get this almost sort of visceral, tactile, organic feel of history as distilled in these objects. I'm curious to know, in the sort of, you've seen the evolution of history and history keeping over the next nearly half a century. In an increasingly digitizing and, if I may use the term, paperless world, do you see these objects diminishing or losing out? Are we, or are they still there?
This is a very interesting question. I'm obsessed with the object, so I don't think there'll ever be a time when it won't be intriguing to look at the actual thing, to be able to walk around a display case and see the back of an object, or even occasionally sometimes if they put a mirror to see the bottom of it. I, of course, was in an incredibly privileged position in that I could probably unlock the case and take it out and feel it. And I don't think there will never be a substitute for that. I don't think you can fully understand how an object works unless you can look at it closely. I know from my own experience making database entries, it's no good just looking at a photograph. You have to have the object in front of you to understand how it works. So you're absolutely right that the digital world is galloping towards us, and some of us, now antiquities, will never see the the fruition of it. But it's going to be very exciting, and it will mean that there's much greater access than there is at present. But having said that, I still believe that there is no substitute for actually seeing, examining, holding the object concerned. And here I should just very briefly plug the fact that at the British Museum we have a service where if you make an online appointment, you can go and see anything in the collection.
Any more questions from anybody? Please.
Well, this is a very mundane question. You did say that, you talked about the scroll that you discovered in the cupboard at the British Museum. Yes. Was there any other object that you found that enthused you, which we don't, if we go to the British Museum, we don't have a chance to see?
Oh, goodness. Well, perhaps I can just turn the question around and say that scroll you can see on display in the British Museum, and the fact that it's 9 meters in length means that every 6 months we can roll it on and ensure that the painting's not damaged by light. I suppose the big thing that is not well known and not well represented in the museum collections or the displays today is the remarkable collection we have of Indian textiles. They're quite different from the much more famous ones at the Victoria and Albert Museum, but we have wonderful things also, and that's why I was particularly keen to have examples in my book, because they're a sort of, they're something of a poor relation, I suppose you could say, compared when you view our gallery displays, which, to be fair, are, well, they're dominated by sculpture, and we do have wonderful sculpture, so it's difficult sometimes to get the balance absolutely right.
Is there any more question? If not, then we are bringing this session to a close. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking. I think so. And please buy Richard's book, which is, no, I mean, as somebody who is invested in history and art history and the museum profession, I strongly recommend it. And I think it's available in the Story bookshop across, yes, it's just here, and you can get it signed by Richard. Okay. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you so much for